Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I am very excited to talk to this author, SB Diviya, about her debut novel, Machinehood, which is one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year and is probably going to be high on my best of at the end of the year. We're going to talk a lot about Machinehood as we go along. So I can tell you that you probably will get more out of this if you just trust me. Pause this podcast, go buy the book, come back and listen to us to expand on these ideas. But if you need us to convince you further, here we go. Diviya, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Let's talk about how you got into science fiction and what's your science fiction origin story, because you could be doing lots of things with your life, but you've chosen to write science fiction. How did you get into science fiction as a reader, and what was the tipping point that made you want to do this as well?
I got into it as a reader as a child, at some prodding from my dad, actually. I was about 9 or 10 and just reading random whatever I picked up off the library shelves, and he wanted me to up my reading game. He was not a science fiction fan himself, neither was my mom. But he had a coworker who suggested that I might like it for whatever reason. And so to stop him from bugging me about it, I asked my school librarian, I was, I think, fourth or fifth grade at the time, for a science fiction book. And she handed me a book that has changed my life. And it was not a famous one. It was called The Green Book by Jill Patton Walsh. Very slim little thing. But it's one of those stories that has a twist at the end that just kind of blew my mind. And it wasn't any of your standard, alien, Martian type of tropes. And so I was won over and have basically never looked back. As far as the writing goes, I did my first bit in a class assignment in 8th grade. And it was a story with a bit of a cliffhanger ending. I thought it was a Lady and Tiger ending, as many beginning writers do. And my friend was like, no, I need you to finish writing this. And so I took it home and I started just winging it, chapter after chapter. And I had one willing audience. And that was enough to keep me going. But then I went off to become an actual scientist, and college was Caltech, which was kicking my ass. So sophomore year, I took one creative writing class, and that was the last completed story I did for about 15 years. I just worked as an engineer, put off any thoughts of being a science fiction author to, winning the lottery or retiring, whichever came first. And then about 8 years ago, decided that I didn't want to wait until I was retired or winning the lottery, that maybe I should start now and make time for it. And so at that point, I got serious and said, okay, I'm actually going to submit and try to publish. And I started in short fiction because I had a kid and a full-time job. And I've kind of worked my way up to now having a full-length novel out this year.
Right. And we'll talk about that science background, because I do think that that's important, especially when we're talking about Machinehood. But after Green Book, right? And you had to have had other authors that you delved into, or ones that sung for you, that continued to blossom this passion. What are some of the names of the authors who really influenced you during these early reading years?
My biggest influences were Frank Herbert and C.J. Cherryh. I also loved Joan Vinge's books. Her novel Scion was like the first book that ever made me cry. I think I was 12.
That's awesome.
like actual literal tears. I was like, I didn't know this was possible. Um, and I liked Asimov, especially at that age for his ideas, which I continue to think are very good. Though prose wise, as an adult, I prefer Bradbury if I'm going for, classical age science fiction. Um, yeah, and then I mean, Frank Herbert and C.J. Terry, like I have devoured their entire over as wrote papers on Dune for high school English class, like any excuse I could get to dig deeper into either of those authors. And
Mhm.
Satine was like my best friend through much of high school. I would just anytime I was grumpy, I would just sit down and read that book and just love spending time with the main characters there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and those foundational authors are, and also part of the whole journey is some of these authors like Asimov, where you were really excited about them when you're young, but when you read them as an adult, you get a chance to, that can be one of the major teaching things for an author, is to see like, hey, I love this, but where can I grow as an artist and learn some things. I think revisiting some of those books are actually important to see like what they're missing, you
Right.
know, what you see as an adult. Yeah. Well, no, that's really cool. And so so the science thing, that you took serious being a scientist. You said you went to Caltech. What were you studying? Because I think that does play a role in the novel that we got, right?
Right. Well, when I started at Caltech, I actually was on track to be physics and astronomy.
Mhm.
And then halfway through, I diverted to computational neuroscience, which is the part that plays a very deep role in everything in Machinehood. So it was a really nice sort of integrated program where I could bring in physics, biology, and computer engineering. And so I've never been good at single-mindedness. I like breadth. I'm interested in everything. I'm more of either a dilettante or a Renaissance person, depending on how complimentary you're feeling. But I like breadth of knowledge, and so having a multidisciplinary major really worked well for me. And so I still love astronomy and astrophysics and the concepts of it, but I just as much love, the brain and electrical engineering and all the things we're building. And so I try to put those things together as much as I can, even in my work.
Well, the fun thing about astronomy is, speaking as somebody who's a big astronomy nerd, and like all you really need to do that on your own is, I mean, you can do that on your own as a hobby. Lots of people do. Lots of
Hmm.
great discoveries are made by citizen scientists in astronomy still to this day. So it's
Yes, absolutely.
the night sky is always there for us. So that's one of those exciting things. So just as an astronomy nerd, I just for a second I want to unpack, how did you get interested in that? Was that through science fiction? Was science fiction what started that, or was it just looking at the night sky on its own?
I think there was some inspiration from science fiction, and there was some inspiration from a research project I did in school on the life cycle of stars. And I was just absolutely fascinated with everything I learned, from the birth of stars all the way to neutron stars and black holes. And I suspect that some of the reason I chose that particular science project was inspired by science fiction and space travel.
Mhm.
But once I got into, just the physics of star formation and evolution, it stopped being about the fictional aspects, and I was just really, really fascinated by the science of it all. But
Well,
the
when I
same thing happened once I got into neuroscience. I was like, oh, like the brain is as much of an unknown as the distant reaches of, our galaxy or our universe. And so that also really, really fascinated me, just recognizing this was the 90s. And so it's like we knew certain physiological aspects, but there was a lot we just didn't understand as far as how brains work. There's still, I think, a lot that we don't understand as far as how brains work. And so I feel like in terms of scope of discovery as a scientist, there's a lot to be had in that field just as much as in astrophysics.
Now, I've had a couple astronomers on this podcast, and one Caltech one too, as a matter of fact, Konstantin Batygin. And when I talked to Konstantin about it, I kind of picked his brain about the idea that he learned multiple languages when he was young because he grew up, his family was Russian, he grew up in Japan, and then he had this opportunity. Then he didn't even care about astronomy or science until he got older, right? And I asked him if he thought that the ability of learning all those different languages, if that made him more pliable towards the sciences. And I'm wondering if for you, if you think that reading science fiction as a youngster had anything to do with your ability to grasp these intense, because star formation or how the brain works and mapping the interior, as it were, these are big cosmic things. And I think reading science fiction as a young person can help someone kind of tackle these ideas.
Yeah, possibly. I think I was reading either science fiction or occasionally classics of English literature. And I also came from a household that was very idea forward. You know, there's both my parents really enjoy delving into Hindu philosophy and other types of philosophy, but we always got into discussions of big ideas. My dad was an atheist. My mom started out religious and kind of has ended up agnostic. So we had a lot of conversations about that, which is a big weighty topic. And so I guess I wasn't raised to shy away from big ideas, and I definitely appreciated the big ideas that science fiction brings to the table as far as the imagination. One of the things I love about getting older, and actually even after I got to Caltech, was being able to geek out with other people and kind of delve into those big science fictional ideas. Because growing up, I didn't know anybody who read the books I read. And so it wasn't till I found my fellow science nerds and then the internet that I really discovered how widespread, you know, fandom was for a lot of these things. But I was completely on my own. I just read it because I loved it, and I had, you know, no one really to share that with until I was much older. But no, I mean, I think to your point, I don't know. I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. Like, was I drawn to science fiction because I like the big ideas, or,
Right.
you know, did the science fiction draw me to the big ideas? I'm not sure which came first.
Right. Well, and it seemed it's cool because a lot of times with parents like who are encouraging of these things, and you know, we get a big difference in, you know, the parents who just didn't care at all, right? Like my dad had this rule that he would buy me any book as long as I could convince him that I read it. And so when discussing with my political scientist father Dune or Foundation, like he never liked science fiction, but he understood why I got it because he liked talking about it through those ways. When you came home after reading these books, were you able to bond with your father on hey dad, you sent me this way and look at what I found, right?
A little bit. I honestly, I don't recall spending a lot of time talking to my parents about science fiction. I should ask them if I really did when I was a kid. It was more, I think, with movies, we all would sit down and watch, you know. So we watched Dune, the movie, the David Lynch movie, and that's what got me to go and read the book and then all the other books. And then I also went off and watched all of David Lynch's stuff. So I'm one of those rare people who actually likes the 1984 Dune because I have it to, again, I have to thank it for getting me, you know, into one of my formative years favorites. And so we would talk, I guess, about science fictional movies, whether it was Star Wars, Dune, not so much about the books, though we did a little bit, I think, with things like Foundation.
Mhm.
But no, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that my parents were super excited about my being into science fiction. Like they were glad I was reading, bigger and better books at a higher level, actual full-length novels, and that I enjoyed it. But to them, it was a fun thing, and science or engineering or medicine or law, it's like one of these
Yeah.
other things would have to be your serious pursuit in life. But to be fair, like today at this point, in the second half of my life, they are very thrilled at my writing career and totally supportive. I'm not sure that would have been the case if I had gone into college saying I want to be a novelist.
If you had started wanting to do that, yeah.
Right.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I see that. See, it was interesting. My father being an academic too, he as a political scientist, he just those two books were the ones that I was able to talk to him about were, but he was very encouraging of just the fact that I bought Stephen King's It when it came out, and he was like, "You're gonna read that whole thing, that whole doorstop." Okay, well, you gotta, I might not care what it's about, but I'm just glad you're reading it. And so he was just excited, and yeah, he's always been supportive of just because I have learning disabilities. I'm severely dyslexic, and the fact that I was so into reading and writing because of it, like he was pretty stoked on that. So, but okay,
Yeah,
so
that's
now,
awesome.
yeah, so with when you started to take this seriously, so you have a career as a scientist, you're doing this thing, you decide I'm going to start with writing short stories. Um did the first story like pulling a tooth, or the first serious story, or did it flow out of you super easy?
Oh gosh. It rarely flows out super easy. Um, the the first story I wrote that I completed. So I never really completely stopped writing in between. I just dabbled and never really finished anything. So I like had fits and starts where I might have, a long weekend and be like, I'm gonna sit down and write a short story, and I would get 3 pages in and lose my way. Um, but I pretty consistently, starting in like 2003 or 4, I was writing on LiveJournal, not publicly, but to my friends. I was blogging pretty regularly on there and journaling. So even though I wasn't writing fiction, I was continuing to write prose, and I feel like that kind of kept the wheels greased, so to speak, so that my writing skills were not rusty when I decided to get back into fiction, but my actual fiction writing ability had never been trained. And that's what I kind of realized in looking at this detritus of the past 15 years was I would dive in, as we say in the industry, I was a pantser. I was like flying by the seat of my pants. Oh, I have this great idea. I'm just going to sit down and start writing. And 4 or 5 pages in, I'd have no idea what's supposed to happen next, and I'd kind of get frustrated and lose steam and set it aside. So when it came time to take it seriously, I decided I need to take a class. Like I need to educate myself, figure out how to write the not just the beginning, but also the middle and the end of the story, and to finish it, revise it, and be able to submit it for publication. And so I signed up for an online class. Between my engineering work and my, at the time, toddler, there was no like getting out of the house even for, evening extension classes or anything. I needed something super asynchronous. And so Gotham University had these classes where it was all online. Nothing was live. There was no live instruction. The instructor posts their notes and the assignment. You turn in your work, you critique each other's stuff all on your own time whenever you get to it. And then, there's weekly deadlines. So that ended up being really perfect. It forced me to finish two stories, which was an accomplishment in itself. neither of them was great. Neither of them has ever since been published and will probably never see the light of day. But
important for you.
yeah, but it was a good milestone for me, and I learned a lot from that class, including, the practicalities of how to submit in the modern world. Because back in my high school days, the last time I had even considered sending something to a magazine, it was like you go to the library and you check out Writers Market, and it's like that's not how things work today. So I really needed all that. And then after that, it was just a matter of practice, And no, it's pretty rare that things just like nothing flows like honey from my fingertips. There are stories that I can write faster than other stories, but everything goes back through revisions, and the more experience I've had as a writer, the more I tend to plan out the story in advance. And that actually makes things go faster for me.
Well, I'm a religious outliner, and I like to think that I can sense. Well, I can sense sometimes when I'm reading a pantser and they haven't like planned it out and things are meandering. So, and I'm not. There have been times where I've been wrong, where I thought, oh, this person's definitely an outliner, and they weren't. However, I think this novel is very well structured, so I can see the planning there, and thought I was in good hands for most of that. So you can feel good about that. But now, was there a breakthrough story or a story that, because you have a short story collection, correct?
Yes.
Which is on my list of things to read. I've just read Machinehood, but is there a short story that you feel was your breakthrough or the one that you're most proud of before we get into Machinehood?
The one that was the breakthrough is my Novella Runtime, which is included now in the short story collection, which is called Contingency Plans for the Apocalypse and Other Possible Situations. It's a long title.
I like the title. It's a great title.
Yeah, so that short story title was for a story that came out in Uncanny Magazine a few years ago. But Runtime, I think, was what kind of, I would say, was my breakthrough in terms of getting a lot of notice from other people, other writers, people in the industry, editors, and readers to some extent. Because prior to that, I'd had, I think, 3 like flash fiction pieces, which are, 4 or 5 pages long. They're very short. And this novella came out as a standalone book. It's very short. It's like 120 pages, so it's not, it's not what you would think if you're like, I'm going to buy a book. This is a very slim volume. But it was nominated for a Nebula, and that, gets you noticed. So that would be what I would say is my breakthrough. I don't know what I'm
Pretty
most
good.
proud of. I mean, if I have to say what am I most proud of, it's usually like the last thing that I completed and sent out quite often. And so I feel like I'm still learning and improving, and I hope that I continue to learn and improve for my entire career as a writer. So ideally, each thing is better than the last one, right? Because
Right.
you're always making that kind of progress. Now, readers are never going to agree with that because they're going to have their favorites. But for
Yeah.
me personally, yeah, it's whatever I'm working on now is like the shiny fun thing, and whatever was last published was probably the best thing I've written.
Well, I had this strange situation of the last book that I published, I wrote in 2010, and I've written like 6 or 7 novels since then. And that, for that reason, it hurts, because I'm like, I know I got way better, including the sequel to that book. But sometimes you just have to let go and and be like, you got to be okay with the growth process that's out there, and eventually things will be found in their right order. And I've had books that came out before that I wrote after it, and so on and so forth. But it's just strange how that happens sometimes. You'll see when you're writing for longer and you have those. But Machinehood is a debut novel, and I did not know that when I read it, because there's 2 ways that I read a book that I should let you know about. Which is, one is that a lot of times I put a book on hold at the library or buy a book and I wait a couple months to read it. So I forget what it was about. So I can go in cold. And I didn't read The Dust Jacket for Machinehood. I didn't read your bio, anything. I just, at some point I knew I was really interested in this book and I put it on hold at the library and it came in. And then I was like, looked at the cover. That's all I knew, the title. And I started reading. And I like this method because I'm able to go into a book cold. I'm not like trying to guess where the elements that I read about on the Dust Jacket are coming in. And then I feel like I'm closer to having the experience that the author wants me to have reading it is discovering the whole story. Now, as we start talking about Machinehood, you have a history with robotics and AI. And I think that that's important before we get into what the story is actually about. Like, why you are in a position to write this book that nobody else is. And that is one of my favorite things when you find an author who has a unique perspective that can write. Nobody else could write this book, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Only Diviya could write this book. And tell me a little bit about your background, because I think that's really interesting to the story of this book.
Sure. So I took that computational neuroscience degree and went off to start working and earning money as an engineer. And my first job was in medical devices. And so I've always been fascinated, as we said earlier, about the brain, about neuroscience. But then, once I became a working engineer, um, I got a lot more interested in biotechnology in general and also cybernetics and kind of the meeting point between human beings and machines. And I continued to inhabit, the tech world, right? I was working in chip design, various things, but in that space over the past 5 to 10 years, we've started having a lot of conversations about what today we're calling artificial intelligence. A lot of people are going to argue with what exactly that means and whether we should even apply those words to the software and algorithms that we have today. But regardless, it was becoming pretty clear that machine learning and intelligent software was starting to be able to do a lot of the work that human beings were able to do, that robotics and factory robots were becoming a lot more sophisticated and also, again, being able to do what human beings were able to do. And so looking forward into this century, there was a lot of existential angst about the labor force, about the future of education, the future of work. I think those conversations are still ongoing. What do we need to retool our populace to be productive, competitive in the coming decades? And so this book kind of was my exploration of those questions and me attempting to outline one possible future in which I bring in artificial intelligence, I bring in robotics, I bring in biotechnology, I bring in material science because there's a lot of advances happening there. I had a lot of fun researching sort of the leading edge of what's happening with science and technology today in many of these spheres, and then thinking about how they're going to affect our daily lives. And so I guess what makes my perspective unique with this particular book is that breadth of knowledge and wanting to kind of put all these different pieces together into a cohesive whole and to really build what I hope is a believable world. I'm not going to say I'm predicting the future because no one can do that, but I want people who read it to feel like this is a future that they could see happening. This is a future that our descendants might actually inhabit. And then from there, you can start jumping off to, well, is this a future we want to inhabit, or do we want things to go in different directions from the ones that I have envisioned?
Well, and it's funny too, because speaking to somebody who does a Philip K. Dick podcast, Philip K. Dick didn't give a shit about predicting the future. And he used to actually get in fights with his editors because he would set it like 20 years in the future and they'd say, "This is impossible, Phil." And he'd say, "I don't care." Like, because he didn't care about getting the future right at all. Right.
Right.
And for him, it was just like a surreal landscape to tell his ideas. And what I think is cool about Machinehood is that I do think it's a very believable future. And if you, within my review of it, I think I hit at, and some of the things that we're going to be talking about in the rest of this conversation are things that I think are very believable parts about what this future will look like. And so that, I do think, mission accomplished. It's for me, it's a future that I thought was very, very, very believable. Now, onto the writing of this. One of the things that is, okay, so the novel is written with two basic point of view narrators who kind of run throughout it. But the Machinehood manifesto, which is, so there's this group in the novel. In this future, there is kind of an AI rebellion of a sort, and there's this manifesto that this group Machinehood has. Did you write that out ahead of time, or is that something you developed during the process of writing the book? Because that's, as a writer, I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, no, I wrote that out ahead of time. I have this distinct memory of sitting outside of a library reading the Communist Manifesto and the Unabomber Manifesto and and Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, and just thinking, I wanted to research the language of the manifesto because I knew that I wanted excerpts of a manifesto in my novel. And once I got to thinking about it, I was like, well, I don't want to just write the excerpts. I'm going to write, an entire 2,500 word manifesto because it'll be a fun exercise as an author. And it let me kind of inhabit the minds of my antagonists a bit too, right? What is their perspective? Why are they, what is their social cause? Why are they writing this? Because when I did go back and read those actual manifestos, that's what I came to very quickly realize was these were not people who set out to be evil. These were people who set out to try to right something that they saw was wrong in the world. And however much we may agree or disagree with, either their ideas or even their methodologies, fundamentally, they thought they were going to do something good. And so I wanted my antagonist to have that too. And I ultimately want the reader to have a similar sort of internal conflict as many of us do with historical manifestos and revolutions.
So writing this manifesto, did it, one, change your mind about the underlying issue of the novel, and two, did it change the direction of the novel writing it, is what I'm wondering. I've had this question since I read the book, so I'm super excited to finally ask it.
It did not change the direction of the book. I had already known up front with all of my stories, I know how it starts and how it ends. Because without knowing the ending, I lose my way in the middle. Did it change my mind? I think my mind was already unmade going into this novel. I was not writing it to be polemical. I was genuinely writing it to explore my own feelings about this conflict that, that was under discussion and that we're seeing between human and AI, or human and machine labor. And ultimately, I was also writing this book as a response to the standard pop culture narrative that it always has to be either or. It's us versus them, and the machines will always be something not human, and the humans will always be something not machine. And I really wanted to interrogate that because, again, coming from an integrated background of Eastern and Western cultures, I found this sort of very like hard this or that thinking not cohering with my perception of reality. And so I wanted to write a book where, it's like, well, what if it doesn't have to be this way? What if it's not always a conflict? Are there other answers to that particular question? Are there other ways that society can move into a world in which, human beings and AI labor can coexist? And are there alternatives to the ones that we are typically presented with as answers to these kinds of questions?
And I do want to say for anyone listening at this point, I'm going to try to stay away from story point spoilers and talk about this book mostly through the ideas, because yes, there's a really cool story there that unfolds, but I think the ideas are one of the things that are going to be really fun to talk about with this book, which makes it kind of old school sci-fi in a way, because I like really talking about the ideas. So I don't think anything here is going to hurt you for your experience for reading the book. But if you are super worried about spoilers, pause, go buy, read, come back. Because right now I'm going to start talking about the characters. Welga, who's one of the two main point of view characters, I thought was a really brilliant narrative invention in this novel, because her body itself becomes the theme or the question at heart as the story goes on, right? Because she and her struggles and her issues and her arc are so directly related to her becoming less and less human as the story goes on. And I don't really think that that's a spoiler, like how far or to what level that goes. People would have to read to find out. But I was just really impressed with that, how early on, and then the counterbalance of her sister-in-law being, kind of our every person's view of the world was, again, really great. To me, all stories are parallels and reversals, and a lot of what was going on in with Welga, you get a reversal for how her life goes on, and then there's the parallel with her sister-in-law. That's a lot of me talking about. The theme being tied to Welga's body itself, that was the plan from the beginning, right? I mean, that was, yeah, okay. And can you tell me about writing Welga as a character? How you got to know her as the story went on? Did you discover parts of her you didn't expect? Because she's a great character and so tied to the theme. Just really great stuff.
Yeah, so full disclosure, Welga in the first draft of the book is not quite the same as the Welga in the last draft of the book. Things changed along the way for sure. She was always gonna be kind of a badass, take no prisoners, warrior type, because that is a type of person I am not, and I, like to, in my fictional world, wish that I could live in that, in that person's head and body for a while. So it's a fun sort of character to write. I had to do a lot of research for Welga's character because I don't have any military background. I am not an ass-kicking type of person, and so I had to educate myself with a lot of that. But the thematic nature of Welga's issues and what she goes through in this story, that I knew up front that I wanted, and that did not change. How she responds to some of the specific activities throughout the book and some of like the backstory type stuff with her evolved a little bit as time went on, because as I got into the second half of the book, I realized that, I needed her to respond to the events of the story in a certain way, which required her personality to be a certain way that was a little bit different from how she started out. Nithya, her sister-in-law's character, stayed, I would say, a lot more consistent, in part because that was the character that I could easily identify and relate to. That has a lot more of me in it, and so
Well,
her character is more stable from the beginning.
Yeah, and she's more relatable for the reader in general, and it gives something for us to tether ourselves to. in the narrative, and very smart decision, storytelling wise. So and a good character. So
Yeah, I also wanted to write her character because I feel like that type of character doesn't get shown in science fiction very much. Like we have a lot of well guys, we have a lot of badass action heroes in science fiction stories, especially when it comes to stories with robots or AIs in them. We don't have a lot of domestic characters who are just living ordinary lives and have families and aren't out there on the front lines like fighting things, right? And
mhm.
so that was the other reason, Nithya let me do two things. Like you said, it let me give readers a view into ordinary life and, something more relatable. But also, like I said, to express, I guess, in the science fictional setting, this type of person and how they might react to these kinds of events. Because, I mean, even in terms of what we're living through in reality today with the pandemic, right?
Mhm.
It touches every single person's life. Like it's inescapable. So no matter, whether you're in the hospitals, in the ICU, or at the highest reaches of government, or you're just, like you and me, sitting at home doing our thing, it's going to have an impact. And we rarely get to see that impact on the regular person's life and the small ways in which people get to do heroic things in times of crisis. And so I wanted that particular balance to be struck in this novel with the two different points of view.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the world building, because the world building is really great. I love when world building is done with a scalpel, not a hammer, when it's not like really over the top. This takes place in the last 5 years of the 21st century. So you had a very specific time that you were shooting for, but one of the things that's really good is that we get really subtle moments of talking about the time that we missed in between. They're done very, very minimally and very subtly and done very well. But some of the technology that exists in this time, like the swarms and the bot swarms and the bot assistants and those things are very important to the story, right? Because it's a technological future. But
Right.
when you talk about developing that technology.
Yeah, I spent more time working on the world building and the technology up front than I did on the plot, much to my detriment upon later revisions. Um, but I I just I looked into, like I said, what is happening on the leading edge with various topics, industry spaces, and try to align them with what I saw happening socially. And then I went through decade by decade and kind of summarized what I thought would happen in terms of specific details relating to this book and this world to get me from 2017 when I was writing it to 2095. And so I wanted to have that connective tissue because I sometimes get frustrated with a lot of science fictional stories where we have skipped ahead into the future, but we don't really have any sense of how we got there from here. And I always want to know, like, how did we get there? So even if it doesn't make it on the page in great detail, I, as the author in my head, want to know, what were the stepping stones to get us there? Like, how do we realistically get there from where we are today? So I spent some time mapping it out, and a lot of it is just extrapolation, honestly, from things that are happening in research labs around the world today to my conception of how they might become integrated into the consumer economy of the later decades of this century. The only thing, there's two things actually in the book and its world building that I am less certain of. One are the space stations. I feel like as science fiction authors and fans and readers, we are always a little too optimistic about the rapidity of space travel and development in space. So that may or may not get as far as it does by the end of this century in reality. But I wanted it, so I put it in because that's my prerogative as an author.
Right.
And the other is the biotech and genetic engineering revolution, which I think could happen. I don't think there's any science or technology stopping that from happening this century. And the way I kind of envisioned it for this book was similar to what semiconductors did for computer and the digital revolution of the past 100 years. The biotech revolution hits, sort of mid-century and really affects the second half of this century. So will that happen? I don't know, but I definitely think it could happen, and it could then create a whole new economic sector that doesn't even exist today and kind of drive progress.
And a huge part of the world building here is how much of the economy is based on the gig economy and virtual tip jars. And we'll come back to remind me if I don't tell you what I thought was the most horrifying scene of the book.
Okay.
If I slip past the most horrifying part of the book, then we'll have to come back to it. But the gig economy and the tip jars, the virtual tip jars, were something that the idea that so much of how you get paid on a day-to-day basis, it reminded me of I recently saw a story about how China is creating this system where if you're caught doing good deeds around town, doing things, that you'll get credits, you'll get social credits for, being a good person. And it seemed to me like so much of this economy is, if I get caught, if I do a good thing, or if I do something for somebody, it was like kind of like a high-tech version of the anarchist principle of mutual aid kind of thing, is what I thought of it as. But I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but that's kind of the way I saw it when I was reading it. So it's interesting, but I really liked the whole gig economy part of that. So I'm sure you put a lot of thought into that. But
Yes,
yeah.
I think that's a somewhat fair reading. Like, one of the things I wanted to do with this book was show technology in a more even light, not simply as all bad or all good.
Hmm.
And in some ways, sort of the having ubiquitous surveillance that is fully transparent in both directions. So it's not being surveilled by a central authority, it's everybody surveilling everybody else all the time, is turning the globe into that nosy village life, right? Where
Okay.
someone can always see what you're doing. So whether, for the good or for the bad, you can be rewarded for the good behavior and discouraged or punished for the bad behavior. And therefore, would that potentially, as you said, in an anarchic sense, will it then drive society to actually be better? Could it potentially? Because we always look at surveillance as a bad thing. So I wanted to kind of turn that a little bit on its side and say, in what ways could it possibly be a good influence?
Yeah, there's just no privacy in this future world. In fact, that leads me to the most horrifying part of the book. So the most horrifying part of the book for me was the sex scene and it was just a random throwaway line where the character said something like, basically like, oh, this time I'm actually having sex in private, and it's something different. And then I was like, wait a second, that's horrifying to think about that. And then I had the thought, like, are people having sex with their virtual tip jar open? Is that one of the ways that they're making money? And then I was like, oh, that's really frightening, and I don't like thinking about that future. So that was the part where you really freaked me out. And that was all world building. That was like one line that I know I pointed that part out in my review, basically saying, like, this was really horrifying. A lot of people will just read past that paragraph and not think about what was being said there, but it was really a horrifying part. So obviously you thought that out in the world building, but you were connecting that to the virtual tip jar. Am I correct? Because that's
Mm-hmm.
okay.
100%.
Yeah. That was
Yeah, no,
horrifying. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was very, very intentional. I wanted to horrify people. And yeah, a lot of people find that the most discomforting aspect of this whole book is this complete loss of privacy and the fact that nobody cares, right? Most people are just like, yeah, I'm fine with it, whatever. I might, clean up some of the camera swarms on the threshold into my house, but a few will inevitably get in anyway. And some people just leave it open because more tips. And not just for the sex, it can be anything that you're doing at home. And I did
Well, we
this
see
intentionally.
people post pictures of their food to get likes online, and it's just an extrapolation of that.
It is. It is an extrapolation of that, and also the fact that throughout history, moral values have changed, and what is acceptable and not acceptable in public has also changed. And it's also not monolithic or monocultural across the globe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there are things that are acceptable in some parts of the world that are completely unacceptable in others. And so I really kind of wanted to challenge the notions of the reader to say,
Mm-hmm.
this is the life you're comfortable with. What about
Mm-hmm.
a future in which everyone's comfortable with this thing that we all think would be morally horrifying, but everyone's totally fine with it because it's just that's how they grew up and it's not a big deal.
Well, and it's interesting too because I, as a PKD scholar, and I chat with other PKD scholars all the time. So when I reviewed this book, I had one of my PKD friends ask me, "Is there anything in Machinehood that's super PKD?" And I mentioned that scene, and I said, "Well, PKD would do a whole novel about that, right?" But that was a part that was very PKD to me in a good way, and I was like, well, he would have built a whole novel out of that, but it was just one terrifying scene in a much larger thing.
Right.
But I mean that as a compliment. That was the thing that reminded me most of the guy that I spent all this time studying his work. Now, another thing that I thought was really huge in this book and was really important is, before we get into the rights and the ethical debate of the novel, and I do want to get there. As you can see, I keep kicking that ball down the road a little bit because I want to do that towards the end. But one of the other horrifying parts is that when basically the social networks, or when the internet goes down, as it were, there's a scene where the social media disruption, it has the effect almost of like the mushroom clouds in the day after, right?
Right.
And there's this part with but I have it here. The roads are full of wrecked bots. People are sick and dying in the streets. No one wants to leave home because they don't have pills or swarms to protect them. And that was really one of the most powerful parts of the book, because a lot of people could say, oh, well, if social media was totally gone, how would things fall apart? But you actually had to envision that, right?
Right.
And so I thought that was a really powerful part of the book. So you had to try to think of, this is how it would work today if it was suddenly gone, and how will it work in this future. But how much did you think about social media disruption as a thing, as
I
being
wasn't
apocalyptic?
thinking of it strictly in terms of social media. I was also looking at it in terms of what if the internet went down, right? If for whatever reason our network infrastructure, because we are so highly reliant on it today. Um, you think about the fact that many of us no longer know phone numbers for our nearest and dearest family and friends, right? We used to have to memorize those, but now everything's always at our fingertips, so you don't know. Um, Navigation.
Yeah.
If you're always following your map on your phone or your car, and it's not a place that you have lived in for a very long time, you don't know how to navigate your own streets because you haven't bothered to memorize the routes, and certainly don't have paper maps anymore. And so it was kind of all of that. So part of it in terms of not having the swarms was definitely more the social media side of things. And again, if that has been keeping people's behavior in check, like what happens when nobody's looking anymore?
Mm-hmm.
How does human behavior change? The micro pills are something that the society depends on to keep it safe and healthy from various biohacked plagues and viruses, and there are multiple pandemics in the history of machinehood. Um,
And Welga
that came
takes
true a
them,
little sooner than I thought.
yeah, Welga takes them to keep up with like machine processing, right?
Right,
Well,
and
so
people rely on these pills to change their physiology in order to make them faster or think more clearly. And so they depend on them for their work as well. So all of these things are ultimately reliant on data and data infrastructure. So when that data infrastructure goes down, then what? And so some of it was thinking about today and what would happen today if the internet went down. And some of it, I think, had to be unique to the world of machinehood. I mean, when you're writing science fiction and thinking science fictionally, you can't only look at how human beings might react to a situation in the present. You have to think about the society that you've built and how those people will then have to react based on their values and their habits and everything else.
now, to me, that I always, a lot of times when I write a review of a book, I kind of come up with the mission statement part, or the part where I think the book hits on the mission statement. And I think that's got to drive this last little part of this conversation. But for me, the mission statement part of Machinehood was when Welga gets reconnected to her assistant, her AI assistant, basically her version, this future version of, I guess the most comparable thing would be Alexa or something like that. And asks this AI assistant, do you consider yourself enslaved? And the assistant responds, I belong to you, Welga, but since I don't have personhood, I can't be a slave. And that's like the crux of the debate right there. Am I right? I mean, like,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. And so that was a huge part of it. Now, Machinehood being, it puts a lefty reader of Machinehood in a uncomfortable place, because Machinehood as an organization is the antagonist of the story, and generally progressive sci-fi leaning readers are going to want to side with the oppressed. And I have to say, as somebody who I'm in my, I became vegan the year when Bill Clinton was 2 weeks in office. I consider myself an animal rights person, enough so that I've done it for 29 years, right? And so animal rights is really important to me. So I struggled, and I saw that you were in the manifesto. Machinehood was thinking about animals in that way, and I appreciated that. I very much appreciated that, because I think if it hadn't been there, my mind would have called bullshit on it, right? But that's just me, because I'm a vegan and an animal lib person. However, at the same time, being that I care about these things, the hard and the challenging part about it is I still think of AIs and I do still think of them as machines. And because I've invested so much of my life fighting for the rights of living, breathing creatures, the fact that they're living, breathing, sentient to my definition, that makes sense to me. Whereas the machines, this book challenged my feelings on it, and parts where the AI device is talking to Welga was very challenging. So well done.
Thank you. I accomplished what I set out to then.
Yeah, I'm not saying you changed my mind, but you made me think about it a lot.
That's all I ask.
Right. So going into this and knowing that that was the mission statement, like, do you in your heart feel that one day machines will get personhood in this way? And is that the point of the book, or is just getting us thinking about it the point of the book? Am I asking you to say it out loud, which I don't know if you want to?
No, it's okay. The point of the book is to get people thinking. I am not, like I said, I'm not trying to be polemical or prescriptive and saying you must, you know,
Mhm.
think what I think. My personal feeling is that the part of the manifesto that I agree with is that intelligence exists on a spectrum. Now, what we define as you said, living and breathing, right?
Yeah.
Is a distinct thing from a non-living, non-breathing thing. But I think both can be equally intelligent. And so the question that it begs for me is once you acknowledge that the non-living, non-breathing thing can be as intelligent as the living, breathing thing, does it then deserve any sort of similar capacity for selfhood and for personhood and rights? And this is another thing that people are talking about legitimately in tech circles as well, because most of us at this point can see it coming in the probably within the next 50 years that artificial intelligence will be sophisticated enough that it's going to be hard to distinguish it from natural biological intelligence. So, so then what? That's really my big question. I feel like we're always having this moving goalpost. Ever since the Turing test was envisioned and has already effectively been passed under certain conditions, we have this moving goalpost of when are the robots sentient, right?
Hmm.
And there is that very loaded word, sentient versus intelligence, and I don't think the two are equivalent. In my mind, they are definitely not equivalent. However, do you need to have sentience in order to have rights? And so these are some of these are hefty philosophical questions without easy answers. And I'm not going to sit here pretending that my answers are going to be the right ones. My gut feeling as an empathetic human being is that we should err on the side of giving any entity more rights rather than
Hmm.
fewer rights, because most of historical and social injury comes from not giving them enough rights. So whether it's animals, whether it's other human beings, whether it's the planet, um, we usually, take before we give. And so in this particular context of writing this novel and the sorts of things I want to challenge people with is, should we be giving a little bit more proactively in this case? Before we're 100% sure that they deserve it, maybe we should give the rights anyway.
Right. Which is part of what another one of the big sci-fi novels of the last year, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, is about giving rights to people who are not yet born, as far as like that they have to
Yeah,
live on this planet, right?
yeah,
So
very fair.
I think extending rights is always a good thing to think about in a science fictional setting. Now, I always root for writers. I'm a writer myself, so I love when I see a book come together, when I see the magic happening. That line when Porquet is the assistant says the whole "I can't be a slave" thing. I was sitting in my chair reading, and I literally like pumped my fist, like yes, because there's something that has bothered me for over 25 plus years since the episode Measure of Man from Star Trek Next Generation came out, which is it always bothered me. I always wanted Data to not give a shit. That I wanted Picard and everybody else to be fighting for his rights, but Data to be like, whatever, I'm just a
Hmm.
machine. I don't give a shit. This is all on you people. You're the one that care about me. And so that moment, I was just like, this 25-year frustration. I was like, yes, she gets it. Awesome. That was a cool thing. Now, and I probably should have brought this up earlier in the sense of it's kind of out of order in the story, but I also really loved the Islamic Caliphate nation and the neo-Buddhists kind of siding with the machines
Hmm.
in a weird way. I thought that was really smart and careful world building. So I'm sure you thought about this Islamic caliphate of the future and these neo-Buddhists that live in space outside of the context of this story. You were thinking about them in the world building process and during your first draft, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. And so, because I thought that those strange bedfellows are so much, these are things that happen in the world. Like groups get together and work together that you would never suspect would work together, you know?
Right.
And
That's why I chose an alliance between China and India right now, because they've been enemies for a while, and I'm like, imagine if they actually combined forces,
yeah,
what a superpower that would become and what they could accomplish.
yeah, exactly. No, and I thought that was a really smart, last year, I haven't found anywhere to publish it yet, but I did a whole bunch of research on science fiction's attempts at tackling the war on terror, right?
Hmm.
Including a couple novels that are set in future caliphate, and ISIS themselves make videos about envisioning their caliphate, like terrible, awful videos, but they're science fiction in a sense, right?
Hmm.
And so they envision their world. So I think it's important that we as science fiction writers don't ignore that that's part of the future,
Sure.
that we have to. So again, that was another like, yes, it's there. Really well thought out future. In fact, I recently said to one of my friends offline that I thought Machinehood is one of the best 21st century world building that I've seen since maybe China Mountain Zhang. That one's I read China Mountain Zhang at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was really interesting when our economy was collapsing and people were fighting over toilet paper, to read that book at that time. And so were you writing this, or were you doing the final proofs and edits at the beginning of the pandemic? Because that's what interests me about, because you said you didn't see it happening as fast with the pandemics, but
No,
we're
all
all
of that, all of that content was written before the pandemic happened. The only thing I was doing post-pandemic were like proofreading, copy edit type, like fine grained
okay.
details, not any of the world building. In fact, the pandemic stuff I had in the very, very first iteration of world building research, because I had seen people talk about the effects of climate change, and one of the repercussions being new diseases and new pathogens, and possibly more rapidly evolving pathogens, and therefore pandemics were going to come. Like, that's not my unique idea.
Right.
There have been scientists saying that for several decades at this point. And so I figured I had to build that into the story again to try to encapsulate at least what we know today and extrapolating forward. Plus, it played very nicely into all the biotech and genetic engineering economy that I wanted to build, came as a natural offshoot of that, which also is happening a little bit faster than we're seeing. But yeah, it's kind of this push-pull, right? Like, as you're seeing with our actual current pandemic, we threw money at the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry, and we have vaccines in record time. We have new therapies being tested in record time. And we will, I think, see, an outgrowth of new industries and technologies as a result of this that then expand into other spaces in society.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Well, it's funny because I was recently putting together a list of books that came out during the pandemic that accidentally hit on the issues, and I added Machinehood to that because along with Paul Tremblay released Survivor Song weeks into this. And
Do
he didn't
you
know when he wrote a pandemic book that it was going to be released in a pandemic.
do you have Sarah Pinzger's book, Song for a New Day, on there?
Yep.
Okay.
That
Because
one's
that belongs
interesting
on
because it
there.
came out just before, but also Josh Mallerman's sequel to Bird Box, which it came in an interesting way because there's so much debating over whether people should take the blindfolds off or not. It became so much like the mask debate, and Josh didn't plan that. He just, that's where the story went. He wrote it long before coronavirus, so it just accidentally happened. And it's in Pinsker's book with the it's very interesting one too, because we didn't see that coming. And I think with Machinehood, a lot of also our reliance on technology and just how much people are doing Zoom and doing these things, like can lead to the lack of privacy in the things that you're talking about in this book, but also like the supply chain problems that we're having now, and seeing like how I could see in the future they're going to start saying, well, we have to address this with technology. We have to have robotic workforces. So, if there's not enough people to drive the trucks, we need to make robotic trucks. So
it is happening right now. I just read a statistic that this year, 2021 has had the record largest number of factory installations of robots worldwide.
Right. Yep, exactly.
Because that's exactly what's happening. The labor force exited and robots don't get sick. So voila.
Well, yeah. So Diviya, you wrote a freaking amazing science fiction novel. I love this.
Thank you.
And listen, I'm a retro sci-fi reader guy. Like, I read all the new stuff when I can, when I think it's really, really good. But I'm a guy that grew up in 20th century science fiction, and I have like a very soft spot in my heart for it. And I love when a new science fiction novel just speaks to me and sings to me. I want to read more new stuff that hits me the same way. So I really appreciate that. Where do you go from here? Because this one, I don't want to put pressure on you, but this was a really great debut. And
so the next one is a little bit of a reaction to this one, because between Machinehood and Runtime, I have two very solid hard science fiction near future stories under my belt. And if you read my short fiction, it tends across subgenre a lot more. And so for my next novel, I really wanted to write far future.
Right.
Still very philosophical. There's still a path from here to there in my head, but the next book I'm working on is set over 1,000 years into the future and involves post-human civilization and its intersection with human civilization. And there's still AIs and robots, but they've obviously progressed much further. And so, yeah, it's sort of my exploration of that space in our genre and looking at things. Again, I don't know, I like to look at things in ways that hopefully haven't been explored before. I'm still an idea person first. So it's still a very idea-centric, heavy world building type of book with a fairly straightforward, but hopefully still interesting and engaging plot.
Well, that's what I like about I like modern authors who you can tell they're a part of the modern world or the modern community, but they grew up reading the same stuff that I like. When I can tell they grew up reading the same stuff that I did. It's like, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with reading totally original stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the golden age, because there are some things that are great from that. But I just have a soft spot in my heart when I can tell somebody grew up on the same stuff that I did. So, and you can feel it in the books. And what I like about Machinehood is that it's a very modern science fiction novel, but I can feel the roots in it, is what I'm saying. So
nice.
Well, I'm excited to read what you've got coming in the future. I really enjoyed this book. I think the themes and the issues that it will cause people to discuss are really important. Is there anything I missed with Machinehood where you're thinking like, well, there's there's one other thing, that's out there.
No, I think we were pretty comprehensive.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a lot to talk about in this book, and I really do hope that it sparks a lot of interesting, conversations over Zoom or over BarCons when those are start to happen more again, or wherever in people's living rooms. That's really all I can ask for. That brings me the greatest joy as an author of this particular book.
Right. And I'm gonna put it out there a bit more before I post this episode, because I want to give people a chance, again, to read it. That I'm really going to hammer home to my peeps that this if they want to be a part of the discussion of my favorite books of the year at the end of the year, then they got to read Machinehood. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you for bringing up these issues and bringing them to science fiction. You've done incredible work, and I'm sure I'll want to talk with you about the next one when that comes out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And we'll see everybody again next episode. Thanks for joining us on Postcards from a Dying World. Bye.